If you are visiting with us for the first time, glad to have you. We've been going through the book of Mark and going through thematically doing that. And we've looked at several themes as we've gone through this series. We've looked at the concept of Exodus in the book of Mark, where Jesus is this new liberator, freeing us from sin. We talked about the crowds and just the various people that Jesus encountered that came to him, and the reality that although there were many people in the crowds, only some left that interaction with Jesus changed. Yeah. We also talked about the different battles that we face spiritually, and we looked in particular at the battle to hear well, right? We can be listening but not really hearing, if you understand what I'm saying. And last week we talked about calling, and the great calling that we have as disciples of Jesus and that Jesus extended to all people was this call to follow him. And what that really means, there's an intentional pursuit of being like Jesus. Yeah. And then this week today, we're going to be talking about grace. And, when I think about grace, actually, the passage that comes to mind for me, and it's perhaps one of my favorite passages, is in Titus chapter 2, verse 12. And in Titus 2:12, it says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age." I love that it says there that it teaches us. Yeah. Here's the reality. I think the truth is the best of us is a mess. Yep. Yeah. That's just the reality. Yeah. And if we have that self-awareness to recognize that, this is a very encouraging thing, that he teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions. Yeah. One of the things about what this tells me about God is that he graciously transforms us. The truth is, I think we were hanging out with Spencer and Maya, and I was just telling them about in my younger days what I was like. Things like not paying rent to my roommates exactly, right? Dom was like, "What?" That's what they said. Yeah. And sadly, I felt like I was justified in not doing so. I needed the continual transformation of God to help set me straight. But the reality is, even non-religious people pursue transformation. Yeah. I was a week before last week, we went to Barnes & Noble. We were looking for a Bible. Yeah. And, I'd never been in that Barnes & Noble before, so I didn't know where. So I'm kind of going through the store, and I looked at the self-improvement section, and I didn't see any Bibles there. Finally, I found the religious section, and it was, there were the Bibles. But it indicated to me that, the pursuit of self-improvement isn't just for the religious, right? Yeah. There are lots of people who recognize, who have the self-awareness to say, hey, you know what? There are things about me that I feel like ought to change. Yeah. There are things about me that I'd like to be different, right? Sure. And that self-awareness is present. Not everybody has that. We all know people who are not self-aware, right? But whether you're religious or you're not religious, there are people who just recognize, man, I need to be different, I need to grow. Yeah. But what I did think was ironic was that really the most important book in terms of self-improvement, the most important book in terms of transformation, the Bible, wasn't in the self-improvement section. Yeah. Which tells me, man, there are people who desire change, but they're missing out on the greatest agent of change, sure, which is God. If you want to have the greatest benefit from the grace of God in your life, then you're in luck, okay? All right. Because the title of our lesson today is Learning from the Grace of God. All right. See, the book of Mark gives powerful lessons of how Jesus intended for his grace to impact us. Mm-hmm. And one of those lessons is centered around two incidents when Jesus miraculously feeds the crowds, okay? And now, I'm not actually going to read from those incidents, but I want to give you a quick background because I think a lot of people are maybe familiar with the story, but for those who aren't, I want to give kind of a quick background of what happened. So in one of those situations, the first of those situations, Jesus is spending time with his disciples. The disciples, he had sent them out to go preach. It was their first sort of mission, and they're coming back. It was very successful. The crowds are huger than ever. They're really excited about what they heard preached. And it's so packed that they don't even have room to eat in the house. And Jesus, recognizing that his guys are probably tired, he's like, hey, guys, let's get away. And so they get in a boat and they go to the other side of the lake. But the frenzy for them is so high at this point that people see where they're going. And this lake, it's not a super large lake. It's one where if you are there are lots of hills around it, so you can see everything that's going on. So people essentially just walked and met them on the other side. And so he gets there, and there's a crowd of people, and it says he's filled with compassion, and he begins to teach them because he recognizes that they're harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd, right? Sure. But as he's teaching them, the disciples look around. They're like, man, it's late. It's late, and they're not close to any villages and all that stuff. And they're like, Jesus, send them away so they can go get some food because it doesn't look like they brought anything. And Jesus' response is like, hey, you give them something to eat. And they were like, wait, if we had 6 months of wages, we couldn't feed these guys. Yeah. And Jesus said, well, what do you have, right? And they find 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And with that, Jesus prays, and he just starts to multiply it. Wow. And in the end, they feed over 5,000 men, not counting women and children. And it's amazing miracle. It's phenomenal. And it says that they picked up like 12 basketfuls afterwards. Sure. So a few months later, we're not exactly sure of the exact timeline, but a few months later, they're in a similar situation where another large crowd has gathered. And again, this time Jesus says, hey, I want to take care of these people. They've been with me for 3 days, and they don't have anything left to eat. And the disciples, strangely, their response is, well, how can we feed them? It'll take and it's like, well, wait, what happened? And Jesus says, okay, well, what do you have? He asks them the same question he asked them last time. And this time along, they have 7 loaves and some fishes as well. Yeah. And Jesus, again, prays, and he just multiplies it. And in that instance, 4,000 people, at least 4,000 men are fed, not counting women and children. And so we don't actually know in these scenarios how many people Jesus fed in these 2 scenarios. But we're going to pick it up right after that. After that, Jesus left with his disciples, and in Mark 8, in verse 11, it says, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus to test him. Now, for those not familiar with the Pharisees and who they are, the Pharisees, they were among one of the main sects in Jewish culture at the time, and they had a lot of influence, and their leaders were very influential in that society. And so they, unfortunately, didn't take a liking to Jesus by and large. There were some that liked him, but for the most part, they were distrustful of Jesus. And so here, this group of them, they come to him to test him. And that might seem sincere because it says to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. You could say, well, they're looking for a sign. They want to believe. Well, here's the reality. The reason they're asking for a sign is because they didn't believe all the many other signs that Jesus had done. Maybe they'd heard about it and they were skeptical and they were thinking to themselves, well, if I can get him in a controlled environment, right? I don't know if you've ever watched magicians do their thing. They set it up beforehand. You're like, oh yeah, I'm sure the crowd is in on it or this person's in on it. That's the opinion and thought they had with regards to Jesus. And so they kind of spontaneously come to him and say, hey, now do a miracle, one essentially you haven't had the chance to prepare for. That's how they're thinking. The challenge is, if he had done it, the Pharisees who recognized that there wasn't some trick going on, what they would do is they would allot it to, this is Satan doing it. It's Satan doing it. And so the challenge is they were just not in a place where they were willing to believe. Right. See, and Jesus' response is, he says, he sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. For those who ask for a sign, when he's done so many already, so many miracles of grace, Jesus says, no sign will be given. These miracles that Jesus did, they weren't like gimmicks. They were in response to people's needs. When you see Jesus' miracles, they were always in response to someone's needs. They were acts of grace. It wasn't for the determined skeptic. It was for the person in need. I was having breakfast with Otha on Friday. We were at the Crow's Nest because somebody was talking a lot about it, and we said, let's check it out. Now, when we were there, the tables there, if you've ever been, they're pretty packed close together. And there was this guy beside us, and as we talked life, right? We talked about our faith and discipleship and, becoming Christians and lessons learned, ways we've been humbled. As we were talking about these things, this guy was listening. And I could tell, I'm like, we're sharing our faith with this guy without, actually talking to him. Yeah. And so near the end, as he was getting ready to leave, I thought, well, let me just formally invite him, because he's either going to be very interested or totally not interested. Like, those are the only two options, right? Yeah. And I turned to him and I said, hey, I just wanted to invite you out to a service at the church we go to. And he said, you know what, I'm an atheist. But he's like, if I do lean partially towards Christianity, so if I had to pick between them, all of them, it would be that one. He was like, try to be nice, and which was great. And I asked this question. I said, so is there anything that could convince you? And he thought about it for a second, and he said, well, if God spoke to me personally, I'd be convinced. He goes, no, actually, I probably would think I'm crazy, was what he said. And then Otha said to him, I have a good friend who used to be an atheist. And I think he sensed where the conversation was going, and he was like, well, gentlemen, thanks, have a great day. And he left. But when I heard that, I thought to myself, essentially, he has said that there's actually no way he can be convinced. Yeah. Even if God spoke to him, he cannot be convinced, because he would conclude that he was crazy. Yeah. Wow. See, it's a predetermined, and that's the reality. Like, I don't know where we're all at spiritually, but if you're in that place, you have to be open to the possibility that there is a God. Yeah. See, these guys asked for a sign, but they weren't going to be convinced. Yeah. And Jesus says, well, you're not getting a special sign. And you may be waiting on a sign to go after your relationship with God. Perhaps that's where you're at. But God's already sent so many signs. Yeah. I don't know if I'm getting older and my movie references are starting to get older. But back in 2003, there was this movie that was out, Jim Carrey movie, Bruce Almighty. And if you've seen that movie, Bruce Almighty, right, there's this part where he's driving and he's like, God, give me a sign. He's asking God for a sign, and he passes a sign that says caution, caution ahead. And he's like, God, I just need a sign. And this truck that carries all these warning signs comes in front of him. And there's like in front, it says slow down, dead end, stop, all these signs. And he keeps going, give me a sign. Give me a sign. And he looks down and then back up again, crashes into a pole. What are the signs God has already given? That's good. I tell you, if you have been invited to church, that's a sign. Yeah. That's a sign. But I've also, in the 28 years I've been a Christian, I've also learned that it's never just that case. If you've been invited to church, there are many other things that God's been doing already in your life. Those are signs to pay attention to. We're going to read here in verse 13. It says, then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf. I love all these things they show about the disciples, because it encourages me, right? It's like, if these guys were in Jesus' company, maybe I can continue to hang with him, right? Yeah. But it says they had one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Mark takes the time to point out that they had forgotten bread and just had this one loaf. And then it mentions here this yeast. And in Old Testament, it was a symbol of contamination and a spreading influence. And teaching, Jesus was referring here to the teaching influence of the Pharisees, okay? But in verse 16, it says, they, the disciples, discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. See, they misunderstood Jesus, and it was in a way that they shouldn't have. And we'll see why they shouldn't have in a second. See, sometimes you and I misunderstand God's words. We misunderstand his actions. We misunderstand his motives. And we do so in ways we shouldn't. In verse 17, it says, aware of their discussion, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? What a rapid-fire set of questions. Yeah. Yikes. What is it about this that bothered Jesus? It's clear from his response that they shouldn't have misunderstood, at least not in the manner that they did. And so the question is why? Well, let's look on. He says, and don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? See, it wasn't that they didn't remember. Because when Jesus asked the specifics about the baskets, right, they gave the correct answers. They were aware of the facts. They remembered the figures. They knew the details of each of these prior episodes. They were aware of all these experiences, but they failed to turn their experience into insight. You know, years ago, I think it was like 2014 or something like that, and I remember we were living in Waterloo, Canada. We were overseeing like a satellite ministry and just trying to learn how to, lead and things of that nature. And I remember calling Mark King. If those of you who know him, he's a brother. He's leading the church in Vancouver now. And he's the guy who put us into the ministry in Detroit years ago. But this was before going into the ministry, and I was on the phone with him, and he said this thing that really I've always remembered. He says, everyone experiences things. Not everyone turns their experience into insight. Okay? And here's the truth. We can experience God's grace and not turn that experience into insight. That's what happened with the apostles. See, they got to witness the power and grace of God at work when Jesus fed over 5,000 people. Yet, when Jesus was in a situation where he's like, hey, let's address this other need. Let's deal with these 4,000 plus people. They responded as if they'd never seen 5,000 fed by Jesus before. And now, just after all of that, after they'd fed the 4,000, they misunderstood the comment, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. Because how could they think Jesus was troubled about them having only 1 loaf of bread? As if that was going to stop Jesus. He expected them to turn past experience of God into insight, of his grace into insight. And so the question I've got to ask is, what about us? If you are a disciple of Jesus, right, you've seen God's grace to you expressed in multiple ways. Maybe you prayed to get closer to God at some point, or to find a church, and then somebody stopped you and invited you to church. That is an act of grace on God's part. Yeah. That's what happened to me. Maybe there were past situations that you felt like you were beyond your limit, and you begged God for help. You were full of anxiety and despair, and you saw God come through in the 11th hour. Perhaps there's been health scares in your life that carry potentially scary realities for your future that you begged God about, and he graciously heard your prayer. Maybe you face financial challenges that threaten to break you, and you had no idea how you would make ends meet, and somehow God came through. See, the longer you're a disciple, you begin to accumulate ways that God came through, his gracious and merciful interventions. It seems that when they faced similar challenges, Jesus wanted them to look back on the past victories that God had graciously provided so that they would have peace and confidence that God would graciously help again. See, this is important. And why is it important? Well, I want to go back a few chapters to just after Jesus had fed the first crowd of people. Okay, so we're taking a step backwards, okay?
We're with you, bro.
And we're going to go to Mark chapter 6, verse 45. Mark 6:45. So this is right after Jesus fed the 5,000 people, 5,000 plus people, right? And it says immediately in verse 45, right after this, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up to on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake and he was alone on land. See, after this first feeding, right, he goes off to pray and he's separated from his disciples. In verse 48, we read, he saw, right, though he's separated from them, he was keeping an eye on them. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went up to them, walking on the lake. Okay? Now, this is probably the point where when people read this, if they're skeptics, they will roll their eyes, right? Walking on the lake. And if you are familiar with this passage, you've perhaps read it many times, and you read it and you just read right over it and just kind of skim over it. Walking on the lake. Yeah. That's crazy. And it says he was about to pass them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Yeah. I mean, this floored the disciples. They didn't, like, if they had known that that was Jesus, they wouldn't have been terrified. Right. But because it was in an unexpected manner, they didn't recognize him. They imagined the worst possible, but it was actually Jesus approaching, right? Sure. Yeah. And then it says immediately, he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. That highlighted comment there. Mark felt compelled to step out of the story. And instead of just narrating, he puts like commentary. And it's like, well, why do you do that? All this terror, all this bewilderment, all this bewildered amazement, like why was that there? Mark is trying to indicate it's because they had not understood about the loaves. See, we know a few chapters later, they still didn't understand about the loaves, and Jesus had to call them out about it. We just looked at that. But Mark injects in here that what Jesus will later question them about, and it was about their hearts. Mark says here it was because their hearts were hardened. See, experiencing God's grace and not turning that experience into insight is a symptom of a hard heart. When we don't take the time to think through and understand what God has done, we limit our ability to face more complex situations and circumstances with faith. You know, I think I've shared with the church, when we moved into our new house, we ran into some water issues. Sure. Okay? And we were there 2 nights, I believe, before we had some major, major water issues in our basement. And a lot of people here helped out with that. And that was discouraging. And then a little while later, we had some ice damming, which led to some more water issues. That was also discouraging, okay? Yeah. We had really tried to avoid having a home that had water issues. In fact, we steered away from a house that we were looking at because of the potential for water issues at that place. Yeah. And, you know, Carolyn was talking to her mom, and her mom's sympathy was like, her expression of sympathy, she said, "Oh, I know you guys were really trying to avoid that." And hearing that just actually brought me like down. I was like discouraged. And the reality is, but here's the thing. So our previous house, the house we sold, when we moved into it, you know how you're supposed to have those, they call them disclosures? Yeah. And you're supposed to write issues with the house. Yeah. And they wrote on those disclosures that, you know, this house, it says that sometimes in heavy rains, there's some small leaking from the egress windows, and we had 4 egress windows. Let's just say that was an understatement, okay? There were so many nights where I felt like that, you know, that phrase, like there's a movie years ago, A River Runs Through It. That's what I felt like our house was, with the water that would come from these egress windows. We would see them like fill up in the egress windows, and you could see it, and then it's just coming out the bottom, right? And to solve that situation was going to be super expensive. And I remember just how challenged I felt by it, because I thought to myself, there's no way we can sell this house. I can't in good conscience, as a disciple of Jesus, not fully disclose what's going on. And so it's either we're stuck with this, or at some point in time, we're going to have to fix this. Yeah. But the grace of God is that eventually he provided all the resources where we were able to fix it, right? He provided the resources, and we got 3 new egress windows. I mean, it looked great. Like, these were the originals. They were like from 55. They were crusty as all get out. And these things look great. We replaced them. And you know what was amazing about it too is it was in 2025 we replaced them, April of 2025. And we were in a place where it's like, now I could sell this house with no concern. I don't have to fudge or be fake. I can be real and honest. And it was in June of 2025 that Jaron called and asked, "Hey, would you guys be interested in coming to Kalamazoo?" All right. And it was just the timing of God, right? The timing of God. It was perfect timing, because we were taking care of this thing that honestly would mean that we couldn't really sell our house at market value, but it was already taken care of. And we weren't even thinking about moving at that point when we did it. But I say that to say, I marveled in that period of time as we were getting ready to move here about God's grace and his timing and his perfect timing, right? Yeah. But when this stuff was happening at the house here, I wasn't remembering any of that. I wasn't remembering any of that. Instead, I was discouraged. I was disheartened, not remembering any of that stuff. And so it's really, I got to ask you the question, hey, are you remembering the things that God has done? Good question. I could hear Jesus say to me, Olumide, don't you remember? Don't you remember what just happened in 2025? Why are you freaking out about these issues? Don't you remember how in time I graciously provided a way to address it in the past? Don't you remember? See, what has God already done that you are failing to consider, and as a result, you're struggling? Wow. Sometimes, to understand poor examples, it's best to contrast them with good examples, okay? And we're going to look at a good example. And that good example is that of David. And I'm sure we've all heard of David and Goliath, right? And Goliath was the champion of the Philistines. And what would happen in those days is sometimes they didn't necessarily fight a battle when they got together. They would just select one person from each side to go fight. Mm-hmm. Now, Goliath happened to be significantly larger than most human beings, all right? And when all the Israelites saw him, they were terrified. It says that they would actually flee from him when he showed up. Yeah. And so, but we know the story. We know that a young man named David was the only one willing to face him. And so the question is, how did David have this courage when everyone else, an entire army, including the king, was afraid to go and face this guy? Let's take a look. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, it says, David said to Saul, and Saul's the king, so this is David speaking to the king, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant," referring to himself, "will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You're not able to. You're not able to go up against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth." And so there's the obvious size discrepancy. But then Saul points out, he's also an experienced fighter, and you're kind of a young guy. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it."
Wow, that's awesome.
It's impressive. I would not be doing that. But it seems like David had a lot of confidence, right?
Yeah.
Seems like he had a lot of self-confidence. But it actually wasn't self-confidence at all. Because when we read in the next few verses, it says, your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. And then listen to David. It says, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." See, David knew that it was the Lord. It was the Lord who rescued him from the bear. It was the Lord who rescued him from the lion. And I don't know if you noticed, do you see his spiritual logic? Yes. Do you see his spiritual reasoning? Yeah. He turned to his past experience of God's grace, and he turned that experience into insight. He learned from the grace of God, and that's what made the difference. He learned from the grace of God, and that is what made the difference, right? See, everybody was terrified, but here was a man who learned from what God had done in the past, and he wasn't. The Lord was indeed with David, and we know he was victorious. See, what are the lions and the bears that God has graciously already slain in your life? And how do you use that knowledge? Are there situations that you can face with faith instead of fear, hope instead of despair, composure instead of falling apart? Jesus asked his disciples, and I will ask you, do you remember? Do you remember when God, you fill in the blank? Do you remember when God came in that situation? Do you remember? See, maybe you're early in your spiritual walk and you're like, man, I don't have any lions and bears. I haven't encountered any of those things. And you might feel like I felt at one time in my spiritual life when I looked in the Psalms and I saw all of the examples of men like David who were so full of confidence in God. And I looked and I said, you know what? I can clearly see that this was their conviction, but it's not been my experience. And I said to God, I said, you know what? To me, these are just words on a page. They have seen your faithfulness. I haven't. And I asked God to show me his faithfulness. And over the course of the next several years, he did. Now I can no longer say that these are words on a page. I believe them because I have experienced it. Yeah. If you want to have a greater benefit from the grace of God that you have experienced in your life, it's important to remember. It's absolutely important to remember. See, we can experience God's grace and turn that experience into insight. And imagine if you did. Imagine if you turned those past experiences of God's grace in your life into insight for present challenges. Imagine if you didn't fall apart, if you didn't give way to despair, if you didn't get overcome by discouragement. Imagine what God can do when you're full of faith. Let's remember to learn from the grace of God. That's our lesson this morning. Amen. Let's say a prayer, and then we'll have one more song. Father in heaven, we are here and just asking that you might give us a frame of mind where we can look at the things that you have graciously done in our lives, where you've stood in the gap or you've come through in the 11th hour, the blessings you've given us, that we can look at those things and it will inform us about who you are. And Father, the reality of the faith that we can have and the trust we can have in you for the future and for the present. Lord, I pray that you will stir and move in our hearts with the things we've heard this morning. I ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.